Okay, so today we're going to begin I think, one of the most important topics in US 2, all right, called redlining. All right, you may remember me mentioning it last year if you had me last year, but I almost definitely didn't go into that much depth about it. All right, it's such a complex topic, and there's more to it than just redlining. But it's such an important topic because it kind of bridges the gap between the end of Jim Crow and modern day. You know, like if people are ever making an argument about racism and things still affecting black people, and somebody says, well, slavery ended how many years ago, and the civil rights era was how many years ago, I think redlining and the stuff we're going to study now helps fill in that gap between the end of the civil rights era and today, and helps you explain how it still affects non-white people today. All right. It's very, very difficult to overstate just how significant this is. And I'll be honest with you guys, I had never heard of this until I was in grad school. Until 2012 was the first time I heard of this. Never even knew the word redlining even existed. And I taught US 2 for 3 years before I even knew it existed. And when my professor brought it up, I was just floored by this thing called redlining. All right. So let me share my screen and show you guys what we're going to be doing today. All right. So classwork, a place to become redlining is the name of the assignment. And there's a lot of attachments here. And over the course of 2 or 3 class days, we're going to be using all of them. All right. I have posters. I have maps. I have real estate advertisements that we're going to use. I have an interactive map called Mapping Inequality that I'm going to show you guys over time. I have a Google Earth file to show you. On the top right here, the Google form, that's actually where we're going to start. It's a couple of Do Now videos that help explain exactly what this was. All right. And we will also listen to, we will spend a good deal of time listening to an interview with Richard Rothstein, who wrote a very important book, which I will bring in next week to show you guys about all of this, called The Color of Law. Okay. But the central hub of all this that we're going to be doing, oh, by the way, we're also going to use Zillow.com. And you guys know what Zillow is? Like where you look to buy houses, right?
Yeah, we use it like financial.
Okay, right. So basically, what you're going to learn is that redlining seriously inflated the value of white people's houses, right? So my grandparents bought my house where I grew up on Staten Island, in a redlined neighborhood for like $8,000. And when my grandparents passed away, my mother and her siblings sold it for $500,000. All right, that's what I'm talking about here. All right. On the other hand, it seriously deflated the value of non-white people's homes, especially black people. Okay, where you can have the same type of house, and just because they're in 2 different neighborhoods, they have spectacularly different values. And we will use Zillow to look at that. I'm going to spend some time finding what are called comps. You know, houses that are similar, but one's in a so-called white suburban neighborhood in Levittown, Long Island, and one's in, say, Detroit. Okay. Once in a while, I'm even able to find examples in California where the houses are literally across the street from each other, and they have wildly different values. Okay. So we'll also be using Zillow, but the central hub of what we're doing is this document right here, A Place to Become Active Viewers Guide. Okay, because after we watch the Do Now videos and we talk about some things, I mean, watching those Do Now videos will take a little bit of time. It's not regular, like minute or 2 Do Now video, because I stop it and talk about it and make sure you understand stuff. But after we watch the now videos, I will show you guys that mapping inequality website to give you an idea of just how many cities were redlined. And then we will begin to get into watching 2 excerpts from a documentary called A Place to Become, which is about Montclair, New Jersey, which was a redlined city, redlined neighborhood. Okay. And we'll in the active viewer's guide here, we'll read the first few paragraphs. We'll read the introduction, and then we'll get into the video excerpts. Okay. So what I want you to do right now is please open the Google form, A Place to Become Do Now videos. And this is what it should look like. You should have 2 videos. One is called Race, the House We Live In. And underneath, Redlining and Racial Covenants, Jim Crow of the North. Okay. Now I'm gonna play it up here for you guys, and the lights are gonna go off. And I'm gonna stop sharing for a second. I was able to do this successfully yesterday, meaning I was able to have it come over the speaker in here, and you guys were also able to hear it at home. Okay, so wait, what happened to the audio line? All right, guys, just give me 1 second. Here it is. I got nervous for a second thinking the audio connection disappeared. Okay, so what I'm going to do right now is make sure you guys at home can hear this. So let me play this. I've actually got to share this the tab first. Sorry about that. It's only my 2nd day back in the classroom, so I'm still making sure I got everything down. So thank you for being patient. Okay, so I'm going to play a few seconds and ask if you can hear it. Were you guys able to hear that?
Yeah.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. And you take notes directly underneath the video. Okay?
It was a time when hundreds of thousands of GIs came home ready to start families, but had no place to live.
In the 1930s, the federal government created the Federal Housing Administration, whose job it was to provide loans or the backing for loans to average Americans so they could purchase a home.
Okay, so there's a little bit of context I've got to explain here. And some of this you should write down as notes. I'm going to stop sharing for a moment. Okay? So we've already studied the idea or the historical fact that the post-World War II era is really when suburbs began to explode, metaphorically, I mean, not literally. And people by the millions began leaving the cities to live in the suburbs, right? Now, let me turn one of the lights on. That was not the very beginning of suburbs. Don't forget to mute when I'm playing the video.
Yeah, because there's like an echo.
Oh, it echoed? Okay, thank you. All right, yeah, I'm still learning. All right, so the suburbs actually begin in the early 1900s, all right, before the Great Depression. But they were only affordable by rich people, and here's why. Does anybody know how many years you usually get to pay off your house when you buy a house? Yeah, exactly. Usually 15 or 30, usually 30, sometimes 15. How about we say it that way? All right. A lot of banks push 15 because they want to get their money back quicker. But before the New Deal, mortgages were 5 years. All right. You had 5 years to pay off all the interest. All right. So, and you don't really need to take specific notes about this just yet. All you really need to remember is the way that the national government kind of took over and changed the real estate industry. So it used to be where you had, when you bought a house, you know, the government, not the government, a bank would lend you, say, let's say it was 1910, and they were lending you, say, $5,000, right? Which, if you multiply by about 15, is what it's worth today. All right. So the basic rule was that for 5 years, you pay off the interest. And then after year 5, you pay $5,000 for the house. Okay. And that's only affordable by the wealthy. Okay. So if you remember from the video quizzes about the Great Depression, one of the major causes, or the major cause, was that we could not buy enough stuff, right? We made too much crap for ourselves that we couldn't keep up with it. All right, demand did not meet supply. So to try and ignite the housing market, FDR, as part of the New Deal, you know, created a couple of agencies that tried to make it easier and more affordable to buy a home. And the first one, and this is what you should jot down, is the HOLC, H-O-L-C. H-O-L-C, but they called it the HOLC. And you don't need to, I mean, if you want to, you can, but it stands for Homeowners Loan Corporation. And it didn't last that long, okay? But what the Homeowners Loan Corporation would do is they would identify people struggling to pay their mortgages, and they would kind of act as a liaison between the borrower and the lender to try and renegotiate the terms of the loan to make it more affordable to pay back, and sometimes would actually financially help pay it back. So they actually would give out loan money to people, like give out money to help pay out loans. That was the HOLC. It was short-lived. But it's very, very, very important to remember that the HOLC used to use color-coded maps. Okay? There would be a HOLC office in like every city, every town, or every region, every neighborhood, right? And they would have color-coded maps that would rate your risk. In other words, how risky was it to give this person a mortgage? All right, and that's what you will see in these videos, these maps made by the HOLC in the 1930s. Now, the HOLC only lasted a couple of years, and it was replaced by what you heard in the video, the FHA, the Federal Housing Administration, which still exists. All right, now the FHA did not give out $1 to people buying homes. Here's what they did do. Okay, so let's say I buy a house and I got an FHA loan, and it turns out I just can't pay it. So I leave, I abandon the house. All right, if that's the case, then the bank would sell the house under foreclosure, and the US government would then pay the bank the difference between what they got in selling it and what they lent out. So it guaranteed the bank would get their money. So that's when I say that the FHA underwrites or insures the loans, that's what that means. So the bank if the bank knows you have an FHA loan, there's zero risk on their part. They know they're getting their money no matter what. And this was a way for the national government to try and get banks to give out mortgages and help people buy homes. And they also changed the terms of the mortgage from 5 to 10 to 15 and up to 30 years. So the FHA, Catherine, is who's responsible for making the mortgages 15 and 30 years. Okay? They didn't enact any law that said that, but it was such a sweet deal for banks that they all followed it. Okay? And here's one more thing they did. And you don't need to write this, but they amortized it. A-M-O-R-T-I-Z-E, amortize. And I'll assume nobody here owns a home, but if your parents pay a monthly mortgage, they're not just paying the principal, meaning what they still owe on the house. They're paying interest, and they're also paying homeowners insurance at the same time. That's what it means to be amortized. You know how I said originally mortgages were all interest, then you pay it off after year 5? All right. making a loan amortized like that, where you pay the interest and the principal at the same time, makes it more affordable. And spreading it out over 30 years makes it more affordable. If they were still 5 years, no one would be able to afford that, really. Okay? And those interest payments go down every month, while your principal payments go up. Okay? Because you only owe interest on what you still owe in principal. All right? I know that's a little bit hard to digest right now, but I wanted you to realize some important things. That the Hulk used to use these color-coded maps to assess people's financial risk in giving them loans, and that the FHA changed and controlled the mortgage industry while using those maps. That's the important part here. The FHA used the Hulk maps. Okay? So the FHA is who is responsible for blocking black people from buying homes. Because on those color-coded maps, green was the best rating. Who do you think was the green?
Rich white people?
Yeah, well, white people. Didn't have to be rich. White people. All right? And if it was a neighborhood where quote, there was, the phrase they would use was Negro infiltration. If there was too much Negro infiltration, it would be yellow, blue, or red. Okay? So let me get back to it. I'll mute myself.
Federal programs and banks sank millions into the home construction industry. Their message to veterans: you can afford a new home. Buy a new home now. Tax dollars help make the single-family home a mass-produced consumer item. The American dream had a new name: suburbia.
We came to Levittown and we found the model house, and we walked in and we looked around, and of course, in the eyes of a young man who was raised in the ghetto, so to speak, it was an interesting experience, interesting lifestyle, seeing all the new modern conveniences, very fascinating.
Eugene Burnett came home with almost 1 million other black GIs. They had fought for the country in segregated ranks. They returned hoping for equality and the American dream. For many, that dream was a new home for little money down and some of the easiest credit terms in history.
I went up to the salesman. We're interested in your home. We're interested in buying one. And what is the procedure? Is there an application to be filled out? So forth. So he looked at me, looked around, and he said to me, he says, listen, it's not me, but the owners of this development have not as yet decided to sell these homes to Negroes.
The FHA underwriters warned that the presence of even 1 or 2 non-white families could undermine real estate values in the new suburbs. These government guidelines were widely adopted by private industry. Race had long played a role in local real estate practices. Starting in the 1930s, government officials institutionalized the national appraisal system, where race was as much a factor in real estate assessment as the condition of the property. Using this scheme, federal investigators evaluated 239 cities across the country for financial risk.
So that those communities that were all white, suburban, and far away from minority areas, they received the highest rating, and that was the color green. Those communities that were all minority or in the process of changing, they got the lowest rating. and the color red. They were redlined. As a consequence, most of the mortgages went to suburbanizing America, and it suburbanized it racially.
Okay, so the folks at home, you were able to hear the video, right?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so it's what I also would like you to jot down in your notes is that being redlined, it was your house and you if you were black. That was redlined. And here's what I mean by that. In other words, if I'm a realtor, I'm not going to even bother taking on a client in a red neighborhood. All right? Because I know that that house or a prospective buyer of that house would never or almost never ever be able to get a mortgage unless the terms were so terrible. Okay? And I'm not sure how much you realize about supply and demand, but if there's no one who's able to buy the product, the price plummets. Okay? So being redlined meant the house in the neighborhood, but also the black person themselves. So if you were a black person and you were able to afford to live in a quote white suburban neighborhood, and there were a lot of non-white folks who were able to afford this. This was not a matter of economics, of finances. They were able to afford it. They were blocked. They were banned from doing it. So if I'm a realtor and I'm selling homes in Levittown, Pennsylvania, or Levittown, Long Island, all right, I'm a licensed realtor. I'm licensed by my county and my state to sell real estate. And that means I have to abide by certain rules. One of those rules is I cannot do anything that may put the value of the home or the homes around it at risk. And what that translated to is I cannot sell a home in a white neighborhood to anybody but white people. All right, because once black people begin coming in, what do the white people do? They begin leaving because they don't want to live in that quote type of neighborhood. So that affects the value of the home. People who are more eager to sell will accept a lower price. All right. So it followed the house and the non-white people. And that's extremely important to remember. So what does that do? It traps black people in certain neighborhoods. And what does this create? What did the US government just create? What type of neighborhood? So here you have millions and millions of white people who are able to leave the city and move to the suburbs. And with them, they take their property taxes. They take the jobs, then go out to the suburbs. They take their patronage, going to restaurants, spending money in the city is now taken to the suburbs. And now the only people left in the city, and again, this is not absolute, but by and large, the only people left in the city were non-white people. What happens to that city? What happens to Patterson and Newark and sections of Baltimore and Detroit and sections, South Boston, Southeastern Pennsylvania? What happens? When millions of dollars in property taxes and business patronage and jobs leave, what happens to that neighborhood? Don't overthink it. What do you think happens?
Like the value goes down?
Well, the value of everything. I mean, the whole city deteriorates. And what you wind up with is, this is how what we call the ghetto was created. That's literally what being ghettoized means. Being stuck, being forced to live someplace and you can't get out, right? Just like the Jewish ghettos in the Holocaust, okay? So that's what this is. This is the beginning of the downfall of so many American cities, all right? Maybe not Manhattan, but Harlem, the Bronx, all right? Like I said, South Boston, Southeastern, South Philly, All right. Baltimore, Detroit, so many cities were ruined by this. Okay. And this was a huge, huge reason. Having said that, what pays for your schools? Like what pays for the construction, your teachers' salaries? What pays for that? Yeah, your property taxes. So now all these property taxes are leaving. What's going to happen to the schools? They're severely underfunded. Okay. So this is the beginning of the urban crisis of the ghetto. Okay. So it's extremely, extremely important to understand. All right. So I'm going to mute myself. But before I do, you guys have any questions? Okay. So.
As homes in white communities appreciated in value, the net worth of these white families grew. For most non-white families who stayed in urban neighborhoods, the housing market open to them in the 50s and 60s was largely a rental market. You don't gain equity by paying rent.
Where one's family lives in America is not just a matter of taste and preference. You have the issue of housing and wealth. The majority of Americans hold most of their wealth in the form of home equity.
All right, please jot this down. Americans, 80% of our wealth is in our homes. And when I say our, I mean regular people, not people who live in a different universe like Jeff Bezos and those guys. I mean regular people. 80% of our wealth is in our homes. We buy it when we're young. Maybe we buy a second one when we have, you know, some equity and savings built up. We buy a bigger house, and if for 30 years, by the time we're 65, 70, whatever, all right, the house is finally paid off. All right, we then enjoy it for 10, 15, 20 years. Then we pass away. Who gets the house? Right. Usually the house is passed. Did you say the parents? Oh, it depends. Usually what happens? Yeah, usually, yes. Right. Usually it goes to the kids. What was the last part you said? Yeah. Right. It's usually going to be someone they knew or their children, right? So what I'm getting at here is when you pass away, that house does not just become no one's house. It gets passed on to your children. All right. They could either, you know, live in the house or sell it and split the money. You know, like when my grandparents passed away and they're sold for $500,000. All right. My mother got like $90,000 as a result. All right. And that's what you call intergenerational wealth. And if you want to get more specific, it stays in white hands. The wealth passes on from one generation to the next. Okay? In other words, it stays in the family and goes from, you know, grandparents to parents to children and just keeps going from one generation to the next. Okay? I benefited from it. I'm in the house I'm in right now thanks to redlining. All right, in great part. Okay, because my parents got divorced for a second time in 2004 when the Yankees were blowing that playoff series against the Red Sox. So my father was really doubly upset. And they then sold their house to me at a severely discounted price. And they were able to do that because they got it at a severely discounted price because it was my grandmother's house. Okay. And then I was able to sell that house for a lot more money than I bought it for and buy the house I'm currently in. And that's all thanks to redlining. I wouldn't have been able to do that if I was redlined. Okay. My cousin who went to NYU, all right, which now costs about, I think, $70,000 a year. But when he went to NYU in the mid-90s, it was in the high 20s. All right. And my aunt, single mother, worked in a hospital in some administrative position. I mean, she was a boss and made good money, but not NYU money. He remortgaged her house every year of his college education. All right, which meant she took out a second and a third and a fourth mortgage. And she was able to do that because the value kept on going up and up and up. And let me tell you, the entire house is the size of this classroom. And it's worth $500,000 on Staten Island, thanks to redlining. Okay? It inflates the value of white homes, deflates the value of black homes. Okay? Or non-white homes. All right? So what we're talking about here is the US government pumping billions of dollars into the hands of white people who don't even realize it. Okay? Unless they're told, like you are being right now. Okay? That's what this is. This was finally made illegal in 1968 with the Housing Rights Act. Do you guys have any questions? It's hard to see you through the glare there sometimes. All right, so let's get back to it. Anybody at home have any questions? Okay, I'm going to mute.
So that's their nest egg. That's how they can finance the education of their offspring. That's how they can sort of save up for retirement. It's their savings bank, right? They're living in their savings bank.
My family, like a lot of families, was in Detroit struggling to buy a house. You had a dual housing market, one white, one black. A housing market with one with a lot of demand, another housing market with very little demand. My father lives in the house that I grew up in. The house today, 5-bedroom house, is worth about $20,000. That same house bought in the suburbs would be worth today about $320,000. So whites moving to the suburb were being subsidized in the accumulation of wealth, while blacks were being divested.
And these were public policy decisions in which, on one hand, people were given access to property, given title, and subsequently wealth. And on another hand, where people were not given access to property, did not generate wealth, and did not generate the kind of opportunity for the next generation.
Okay, so I guess we can watch the second video. Sorry about that. You guys can just submit your Google form with only notes in the one video. Okay. No, I mean, we can't watch it. So the same thing happened yesterday, and I thought I had it fixed. And I'm not sure why I thought that, because I just went to play it at home and it worked. So I'm thinking, okay, it's fixed, but I guess not. Anyway, all right, so the next thing, say again? Yeah, you can just submit it. Just submit the Google form and you'll get credit for the assignment for that particular grade. All right, the next thing I want to show you is basically, all right, so right here is the first thing I want to show you. But I need you to remember way back in the beginning of the year when you learned about the Great Migration. I believe that's one of the last things I gave you before I went on leave, right? The Great Migration. And you learned that during World War I, and really all the way up until after World War II, millions of African Americans migrated north from the South. Okay, let me stop sharing for a moment. Well, I actually wasn't. So anyway, so what you've got to realize is before the Great Migration, only 500,000 Black people lived in the North, 4.5 in the South. All right. So while the North likes to portray itself as being this, more progressive racially, not as racist as the South, and to be sure, that is true. Excuse me. Nevertheless, you've also got to realize part of the reason why there wasn't this racial tension as nearly as much up north, from 1619 to the Great Migration, is because the North didn't really have a huge population of Black people to live with, never had to grapple that much with that as an issue. So they could be racist, and their racism wouldn't really be exposed as much. All right, because it's easier to ignore 500,000 Black people than 4.5 million Black people, if you get what I'm saying. But when millions began moving north, thanks to the Great Migration, the reaction was not good. You may remember that fabulous video in the beginning of the year called Up South about the Great Migration. And there was one scene where the Black family that moved into the so-called white neighborhood got a phone call, a threatening phone call, then his house was blown up. All right. That gives you some insight into the reaction, right? We had this huge race riot in Chicago in 1919 when a Black boy made the mistake, quote mistake, on a beach in Chicago of swimming into the white section of the beach. All right, and they stoned him to death, and that began 3 or 4 days of massive riots. All right, this white rage riot against Black people for a few days. All right, so the reaction was not good. What we're going to look at right now is the reaction in housing. All right, now believe it or not, redlining actually wasn't the first reaction, the first white backlash against Black people moving north. All right, this represents the first one. Okay, and this sign can actually represent 2 different things. So what you have here is a series of row houses, and they're called row houses because they're the types of houses that are like a train, where to go from one room to the next, you've got to go through the rooms. There isn't like a hallway, so they're all in a row. Okay, so you have a bunch of row houses with X's up top and the word "look" on the top left, and this is real. It's from 1916, I believe, from St. Louis, Missouri. It says, "Look at these homes now. An entire block ruined by Negro invasion. All right, every house marked X now occupied by Negroes. Blah, blah, blah. Save your home. Vote for segregation." So one of the earliest reactions, and the North likes to pretend this never happened, was actual Jim Crow laws. All right, actual city ordinances that would segregate neighborhoods and segregation laws. But these laws were quickly, and by quickly I mean within a year or two, whenever they were passed, they were quickly declared unconstitutional by their particular state's Supreme Court. So far we have segregation laws up north. And remember, when we talk about redlining, it is mostly the North. This is the northern Jim Crow, okay? Now, the second thing that this poster can also represent would be called block busting, okay? So realtors would trick white people into leaving the neighborhood by pretending that their neighborhood was being invaded by, quote, Negroes. And by the way, the word Negro is not a bad word. It was the good word in place of the bad word 50, 60 years ago. It's just a word we no longer use because it harkens back to the Jim Crow era. Nevertheless, realtors would be like what we today call house flippers. Like you buy a house cheap and sell it more expensively. So basically, they would block bust. They would find a house, a city street of all white people, and they would convince them that Black people were ruining their neighborhood with signs like this. Or they would hire, and I am not making this up, They would hire black women to walk around the neighborhood with strollers and babies. They would hire black people to call them up and they pretend to have a wrong number and ask for a, quote, black-sounding name. All to scare white people into selling cheap so that they then can sell it to black people more expensively. Okay? So far we have Jim Crow laws up north that were short-lived. We have blockbusting up north. That was not short-lived. That lasted a very long time. Okay? Now, here's the third thing. And I've got to download this so I can make it a little bit larger. One second, I've got to stop sharing. Where's the download option? Okay, there we go. All right, guys, I'm just making it bigger. All right, let me get back to sharing. Okay, so again, I'll make the assumption that none of you own a home, but when you do own a home, you get the title to it. All right, and the title is just a legal document with your name on it that says that you own the house. Even if it's gonna take you 30 years to pay it off, you still get a title. It just, the title will say there's a lien against the home, which means a loan, and the bank actually owns it too. All right. And it may have, you know, your plot size, which is what you see up here. Let me make this a little bit larger. Okay, you know, it may have the plot size. You know, maybe you bought this piece of parcel right here. All right, but I've got to make this a little bit smaller because it's blurry now. Okay, very often it also has things that you cannot do, a list of do's and don'ts about the neighborhood. Okay, something like if you put up a shed, it has to be this many feet away from the property line. All right, you can only plant this many trees, or you can't paint your house anything but, you know, like brown or white or gray or green or something. There's always restrictions put on what you can do and can't do. Okay, and this is what you would call a restrictive covenant, a racial covenant. So let's look at the next to last paragraph here, and I'll read this because I know it's a little bit blurry because I made it so large. But each of the parties of the first covenant agree and is hereby create, establish, and attach to his or her its land here and above described, blah, 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 the following restrictions. So the rest of the document is a restriction, a series of things that you can't do. And if you go down to the last one, it says that second thing that you won't do is you will not sell, convey, lease, or rent to a Negro or Negroes, or deliver possession to or people to be, it can't be occupied by a Negro or Negroes, no matter how the right of an occupancy or title shall be attempted to be acquired. All right. So the third way that white people tried to keep their suburbs white was racial covenants. All right. And please keep in mind that this follows the house. So if you're a white person and you buy this house and you sell it to another white person, this restriction does not go away. It follows the house. It follows the owner. So it theoretically forever forbids a black person from buying the house. All right. Now, the first time the U.S. government tried to declare these unconstitutional was 1948. They were not stopped used until the 70s. All right. In fact, when the Supreme Court in 48 heard a case about this, one of the judges had to recuse himself, had to remove himself from the case because he had a racial covenant in the title to his home. They were extremely common. So far we have segregation laws, we have blockbusting, we have racial covenants, and then the big one becomes redlining that we begin to see in the 1930s with the FHA, but it really begins to become, redlining really begins to become ubiquitous in the 1940s and 50s when, as you already learned, suburbs began to really explode. All right, and white people began to be able to afford to leave the cities for the suburbs. Black people can too, but they're forbidden from doing so. Okay, so today you learned 4 methods whereby white people, 4 methods they used to try and keep their neighborhoods lily white. Okay, not to mention good old-fashioned violence. When all else failed, get violent, like in that film Up South. Show up on their front lawn, throw a rock through the window, and make their life a living hell until they leave. Okay? If all else fails, that's what they would do. All right, so the last thing I want you to do is open up the Place to Become Google Doc. And that's going to be the last thing we do today, read the first few paragraphs. I want to get to the same spot that Hybrid Group A did. So, again, the name of the documentary is A Place to Become. The subtitle is Montclair Through the Eyes of the Glenridge Avenue YWCA 1920 to 1965. The YWCA is the Young Women's Christian Association, and it's the female version of it's the female to the male's YMCA. Okay? All right. So, Gabby, can you read the first paragraph, a little bit about Montclair, and then you'll call on someone to read the second paragraph. Did you want to mute yourself? Yeah, please.
A little about Montclair.
Sorry, go ahead.
An offshoot of colonists who settled Newark, New Jersey in 1666 after branched west to settle on open land, open, not yet settled by Europeans, that would one day become Montclair. In 1856, the first of 2 railroads come to town. Montclair quickly changed from a farm town to what would become a suburban community. Many wealthy people settled in town and built large houses. They relied on maids, cooks, butlers, and chauffeurs who were often European immigrants or African-American people who moved north on the trains as part of the Great Migration. Indeed, much of what you will learn about was a response to Africans moving north. Some of those who worked in the houses lived there, but many settled in other areas of Montclair, which become home to immigrants from Ireland, Sweden, Italy, and southern U.S. states such as Virginia and North Carolina. These areas of town had houses that were smaller and closer together, and neighborhood schools where children of immigrant and migrant families attended together.
Okay, Gabby, so you're the boss. Thank you. Please call on someone for the second paragraph. If you put your volume down, does that fix the echo? Like when you're the one reading? It might.
Okay. Montclair's African American population grew significantly in the 20th century. According to the 1920 census, the first census that indicated that more Americans lived in urban areas than in rural areas, the locations with the greatest Black population were Orange, East Orange, and Montclair. In 1950, the time frame that we are studying, Montclair's African American population was 9,093, about 20% of the entire population, up from 3,467 in 1920, about 8% of the population. The historical consensus concludes that a result of this growth, or Negro infiltration as many would call it, segregation existed in housing and other aspects of Montclair, including hospitals. No Black doctors could see patients in Montclair hospitals until after World War II, and schools. No Black teachers taught in Montclair public schools until 1946.
Okay, so we're going to read one more paragraph to be even with Hybrid Group A. Catherine, you're the boss.
I don't know where she was. It was hard to keep up because of the echo there.
Third, for 45 years. Thank you.
Thank you. For 45 years, the house built by Israel Crane in 1796 was home to a YWCA for African American women and girls. Through their eyes, we hear the story about a Montclair in the first half of the 20th century, a progressive northern town in the throes of integration, a story that both parallels and intersects the story of the Great Migration from the South, racial integration, and the civil rights movement in America.
Okay, thank you, Max. So we'll stop reading there for today. There's actually one more thing I want to show you. And I showed this to Hybrid Group A, so I'm going to show it to you today. All right. I'd say about 5 or 6 years ago, the University of Richmond took every single redlining map. Did you guys catch how many cities were redlined in the video? Do you remember how many American cities? 239. All right. So this map right here represents every single city that was redlined. And of course, there are bigger circles because sometimes the cities are so close together that they can't have two separate circles. So the fatter, the wider, the bigger circles represent a multitude of areas that were redlined in the United States. So as you can see, it's mostly, mostly on the East Coast, mostly the Northeast. All right, exactly where the overwhelming majority of Black people moved during the Great Migration. Okay, you know, if you scroll down, I'm going to scroll down to locally. All right, and I mean, right now, modern day, the most segregated city in the North is Milwaukee, Wisconsin. But I can also say that statistically speaking, New York City is second. Okay. And as you can see, every single borough in New York City was redlined: Staten Island, Brooklyn, Queens, Bronx. You can't see Manhattan because it's overlapped by Hudson County, with, you know, places like Newark and Patterson. All right, Essex County. That's how many areas right around us were redlined. So we are located right here. This blue dot is us. Okay. So if you want to know close by areas that were redlined, say the New York metropolitan area, the entire thing, Wilkes-Barre, which is also Scranton, where the office takes place or took place, was redlined. Bethlehem, PA, all right, about 40 minutes away from here, where I got my 2 vaccination shots, where it was also redlined. And also a little bit further away, Trenton, New Jersey, was redlined. Camden, Philadelphia. All right. So very often, or almost exclusively, redlined neighborhoods translate to areas, urban areas that have been struggling ever since this began. All right. And that is the historical continuation that I said this would help you understand. Okay. Anybody have any questions before I stop for today? No? No one has any questions? All right. So I guess if you guys have no questions. Oh, wait, I was not sharing the whole time?
Yeah, you weren't.
I'm sorry. Okay, so guys, just give me, you guys here can leave. The folks at home, stay for a second. I'm so sorry about that. You gotta, if I ignore your text, Louis, or anybody else, you gotta yell to me.
Okay.
Okay. So this is the map I was talking about right here. And as you can see, it's mostly the Northeast. Okay. And if what I was spending the last few minutes showing you guys is right here. You know, look at New York City and the New York metropolitan area. All right. All 5 boroughs, Patterson, Newark, all right, Montclair, all right, but also this is where we are, this blue dot. You have Bethlehem, PA, you have Wilkes-Barre, and a little bit south, you have Trenton and Philadelphia and Camden and Chester that were also redlined. So like I said, if the particular area was redlined historically, it's 100% guarantee it's also currently still struggling. And as we go more into this, hopefully you'll understand more why. Okay? You know, but it has to do with the fact that once African Americans were given the right to buy these homes, they couldn't afford to because the homes they were already in were so devalued. Right? And you can't go to a better house unless you're able to sell the one you're currently in for a profit. Okay? So, I'm sorry about that. Let me stop recording.